Geoffrey Chaucer, ca. 1343 to 1400, 1370. The Book of the Duchess, first important extant poem. 1372. First Italian journey. Contact with Italian literature. 1385. Troilus and Criseyde. 1386. Canterbury Tales begun. Social thought in the Middle Ages lagged far behind social realities. Medieval England did not recognize the existence of any class between the aristocracy, a relatively small group that attained its position by birth alone, and the commons, which included everyone not of high birth. There was, theoretically, no way by which one might advance from the commons to the aristocracy. But in actual fact, there existed a large and increasingly important middle class that was constantly infiltrating the aristocracy. And it was into this middle class that Chaucer was born. He was the son of a well-to-do wine merchant, and probably spent his boyhood in the down-to-earth atmosphere of London's Vintry, the wine merchandising area. Here, despite the privileges, especially in the way of education, that his father's wealth secured for him, he must have mixed daily with other commoners of all sorts. He might well have passed his whole life there, counting casks and money. But in his early teens he was sent to serve as a page in one of the great aristocratic households of England, that of Lionel of Antwerp, a son of the reigning monarch, Edward III. The rest of his life Chaucer spent in close association with the ruling nobility of the kingdom. Not only with Lionel, but with his more powerful brother John of Gaunt, with their father King Edward, with their nephew Richard II, who succeeded to the throne in 1377, and finally with John's son Henry IV, who deposed his cousin and became king in 1399. Chaucer's wife Philippa was a member of the households of Edward's queen and of John of Gaunt's second wife, Constance of Castile, and she was doubtless of higher birth than the poet, a Thomas Chaucer, who was probably their son, was an eminent man in the next generation, and an Alice Chaucer, quite possibly Chaucer's granddaughter, was sufficiently important in her day to have been married successively to the Earl of Salisbury and the Duke of Norfolk. The theoretically unbridgeable gap between the commons and the aristocracy was thus ably bridged by the poet. In order to accomplish this, Chaucer must have been able in other ways than as a poet, though doubtless his extraordinary poetic ability was of great service to his advancement. Yet if one were to rely merely on the preserved historical records, one would have little reason to suspect that the Geoffrey Chaucer they keep mentioning ever wrote a line of verse. We catch glimpses of him serving as a page in Lionel's household, 1357. As a soldier getting himself captured by the French in one of Edward III's many sallies to the continent, 1359. Of his being the well-beloved Walectus of Edward III, 1367, despite the term, which means valet. Quote, Chaucer's duties were hardly menial and the well-beloved servant of John of Gaunt, 1374, and of receiving substantial rewards for his services. Of his being sent to Italy to assist in arranging a trade agreement with the Genoese, 1372, and to France, perhaps to assist in getting a royal bride for young Prince Richard, 1377. Of his receiving a rent-free house on the city wall of London, 1374. Of his keeping, in his own hand, the accounts for which he was responsible as Controller of the Customs and Subsidies on wool for the Port of London, 1374–86, and the wool trade was England's largest trade. Of other trips abroad on official business. Of his becoming Justice of the Peace and Knight of the Shire, Member of Parliament, for the County of Kent, 1385–86. Of his erecting grandstands, inventorying pots and pans, and getting himself robbed as clerk of the king's works, 1389–91. Of his being appointed deputy forester of one of the royal preserves in Somerset, 1391. And throughout his life of his receiving grants and annuities, or having them confirmed by royal act when a new king took the throne, or asking that butts of wine given him by the crown be transformed into cash, or merely asking for money or more money. We last glimpse him, in the final months of his life, renting a house in the garden of Westminster Abbey, within a stone's throw of Westminster Hall, the ancient seat of English government. Chaucer's literary career. It might seem that a man so busy would have had little time to write poetry. But Chaucer seems to have been an assiduous versifier all his adult life. Unfortunately, few of his poems can be precisely dated, and some have not been preserved. Probably among his earliest works was a translation of the Roman de la Rose, a 13th-century French poem that exercised a profound influence on Chaucer's work. The first part of the Roman is an allegory, written by Guillaume de Lorris, which tells, in the form of a dream, the progress of a youthful love affair. Guillaume left the poem unfinished, but an enormous sequel was added to it after Guillaume's death by Jean de Meun. In this sequel, the young courtier finally wins his lady, the Toes. But not until Jean has discussed at great length many of the issues considered important by medieval intellectuals. The poem is a mixture of highly diverse elements, and it is characteristic of Chaucer's love of variety that he was able to assimilate into his own work both the courtly emotionalism of Guillaume and the philosophical, often satiric, detachment of Jean. Of a 14th-century English translation of the French poem only a fragment has come down to us, and that without any mention of the translator's name. Scholars are generally agreed that the first 1700 lines of this fragment are Chaucer's. Chaucer's work on the Roman is thought to have been done during the 60s. During this decade he probably made other translations from the French, and kept on sharpening his rhetorical tools. At the end of the decade he produced his first major work, and the only one of his poems that can be accurately dated. The Book of the Duchess, probably completed in early 1369. An elegy for John of Gaunt's first wife, the lovely Blanche of Lancaster, who died in 1368. This is at once one of Chaucer's most derivative and most original poems. Many of its octosyllabic lines, contemporary with Chaucer, and from his countryman Guillaume de Mahaut as well as from other Frenchmen. Yet the plan of the work is imaginative and daring, and as a whole, the elegy is on a level of excellence never attained by the poets from whom Chaucer is borrowing. It is also interesting to observe how that tact which was later to earn Chaucer his status as a minor diplomat controls the direction of the poem and gives it artistic form. In the first period of his literary activity, Chaucer's specific poetic models were French. But a knowledge of writings in Latin lies behind virtually everything he wrote, although the Latin writers Chaucer read were not the same as those which we should study today. He probably had a more than adequate knowledge of the Aeneid and of Ovid in the original. But it is likely that he knew the other classical authors mostly through French translations and paraphrases. He was directly familiar with a number of, to us, cumbersome medieval Latin poems. Certainly his favorite Latin writer was Boethius, the 6th-century Roman whose Consolation of Philosophy, written while its author was in prison awaiting his execution, became one of the most valued of books for the whole Middle Ages, which never failed to find inspiration and comfort in its nobly Stoic doctrine. Chaucer's own philosophical attitude, that of living wholeheartedly in the world while remaining spiritually detached from it, is at least partially a legacy from Boethius. His wooden but painstaking prose translation of the Consolation probably made during the 70s, is only one of innumerable indications of Chaucer's reverence for the Roman writer. The journey that Chaucer made to Italy in 1372 was in all likelihood a milestone in his literary development. Hitherto the influences upon him had been largely French and Latin, and while he may have read Italian before, it is likely that it was his Italian journey that immersed him in the works of Dante, Petrarch, and Boccaccio, the last two still alive at the time of Chaucer's visit, though he probably did not meet them. Between Chaucer and the greatest of the Italian writers, Dante, there was a large dissimilarity of temperament. Yet if Chaucer could not assimilate the Divine Comedy, he nevertheless appreciated its austere moral grandeur, and his work shows its influences in subtle, oblique ways. Moreover, one of his funniest poems, The House of Fame, written sometime while he was in the customs, 1374–86, may be read as a light-hearted imitation of the comedy, though not a wholly successful one, from the works of Petrarch, also a writer of alien temperament. Chaucer obtained less, though he accords him respect on the several occasions when he mentions him. It was Boccaccio, whose cast of mind was far more congenial to Chaucer than the more sober Dante and Petrarch, who was to provide the source for some of Chaucer's finest poems, though his name is never mentioned in Chaucer's works. Many of the Canterbury Tales are indebted to one or another of Boccaccio's works, as is his lovely, cryptic love vision, The Parliament of Fowls, between 1375 and 1385, and his longest poem, Troilus and Chryside, probably completed about 1385, is an adaptation of Boccaccio's Il Filostrato, The Love-Stricken. The Italian work is one of considerable stature, which Chaucer reworked into one of the greatest love poems in any language. Even if he had never written the Canterbury Tales, Troilus would have secured Chaucer a place among the great English poets. Chaucer probably began work on the Canterbury Tales in 1386, and this was his chief literary interest until his death. The old tripartite division of Chaucer's literary career, which assigns him a French period, to 1372, and an Italian period, 1372–85, calls this last period of his life English. But it was not English in the same sense as the earlier periods were French and Italian, i.e., dominated by French and Italian models. For the fact is that Chaucer from the beginning to the end stands apart from the mainstream of English literature. In the rhyme of Sir Thopas, which he assigns himself in the Canterbury Tales, the wonderful fun he makes of popular Middle English romances shows his intimate knowledge of them. And undoubtedly he had read much English writing of all kinds. Yet his notion of literary art seems to have excluded many of the common characteristics, and the characteristic vices, of what had been and was being written in English, so that it is difficult to relate his work to that of his fellow English writers. His friend John Gower is a case in point. Like Chaucer, he wrote a collection of English narrative poems in his Confessio Amantis, The Lover's Confession. And Chaucer tells some of the same stories in the Canterbury Tales and in the Legend of Good Women. The last, which may have interrupted Chaucer's work on the Canterbury Tales in the late 80s, was apparently assigned him by some eminent person, in order to make amends for his portrait of the unfaithful Chryside. He had to write a series of short poems celebrating famous faithful women. To make each story prove exactly the same point and nothing more is something that the conventional Gower had no trouble in doing. Yet Chaucer was able to complete the tales of only 9 solemnly steadfast ladies before giving up in something like despair. And the most amusing thing about his narratives is his evident exasperation with having to make everything accord to a single formula. He could not bring himself to use the simple moralistic technique of conventional English poetry. And what Gower treats seriously appears in Chaucer often to be bordering on burlesque. Every comparison between Chaucer and run-of-the-mill English poetry either so exalts him as to make the act of comparison ludicrous, or else, when Chaucer is trying to behave conventionally, shows him writing with his left hand. Chaucer had no really English period. English poetry had little to teach the first great English poet. Chaucer's art. The extraordinary variety of the Canterbury Tales as well as their number might well have demanded their author's full energy and attention during the last 14 years of his life. But while he was at work on them he continued, almost to the end, to perform what seemed to have been full-time jobs having nothing to do with literature. Doubtless this practical business prevented him from achieving more than the 22 tales he finished. And it probably made him search his old papers for tales that he could work in without substantial revision. Yet if it reduced his literary output, which, even so, is enormous, this lifelong involvement with the practical is one of the chief reasons for his greatness as a poet. From his birth to his death, he dealt continually with all sorts of people, the highest and the lowest. And his wonderfully observant mind made the most of this ever-present opportunity. His wide reading gave him plots and ideas. But his experience gave him people. As a commoner himself, he had a sympathy with and understanding of the lower classes that few men who attained his ultimate station might boast of, and the lower classes must have accepted him. Similarly, he seems to have won full acceptance from the proud and important personages with whom he associated at court. And this he could not have won if he had not understood them perfectly. He understands both the high and the low. But he remains curiously detached from both. And it is detachment, perfectly balanced in his poetry by sympathy, which distinguishes Chaucer's art. Although he was born a commoner, he did not live as a commoner. And although he was accepted by the aristocracy, he must always have been conscious of the fact that he did not really belong to that society, of which birth alone could make one a true member. Medieval aristocratic society arrogated to itself all idealism. And Chaucer characteristically regards life in terms of aristocratic ideals. But he never lost the ability, which for the poorer class was also a positive necessity, of regarding life as a purely practical matter. The art of being at once involved in and detached from a given situation is peculiarly Chaucer's. In the physical realm, double vision results in a blurred image. But not so in Chaucer's poetic world, where images have often an extraordinary clarity, as if reality itself were made more real. His prioress in the Canterbury Tales is an example of the basic human paradox which places what people are in opposition to what they think they are, or pretend to be. Chaucer shows us clearly her inability to be what she professes to be. A nun shows also the inadequacy of what she thinks a nun ought to be. A lady, and shows the great human charm of what she is. A woman. The elements of the portrait are divided between the critical and the admiring. A heavily satiric poet might well enhance the critical comment, so that our ultimate impression would be of the prioress' weakness, while a sentimental one might enhance her amiable sides so as to make that the aspect which we should remember. But in Chaucer's handling, the reality comprehends both sides of the prioress, expresses the paradox without attempting to resolve it. He appears to have been a man who had no illusions about the world or its inhabitants, but was nevertheless deeply fond of them both, and thought it worth while to keep the world spinning as well as possible, either by telling stories of high artistic truth or by counting pots and pans. The text given here is from the present editor's Chaucer's Poetry, an anthology for the modern reader, 1958. 1975. For the Canterbury Tales. The Ngwrt manuscript has provided the textual basis. The spelling has been altered to improve consistency, and has been modernized in so far as is possible without distorting the phonological values of the Middle English. Discussions of Middle English pronunciation, grammar, and prosody will be found in the introduction to the period. The Canterbury Tales. Chaucer's original plan for the Canterbury Tales projected about 120 stories, 2 for each pilgrim to tell on the way to Canterbury and 2 more on the way back. Chaucer actually completed only 22, though 2 more exist in fragments. A modification of the original plan is seen in the assignment of one of the completed tales to a pilgrim who was not a member of the group that assembled at Southwark. The work was probably first conceived in 1386, when Chaucer was living in Greenwich, some miles east of London. From his house he might have been able to see the pilgrim road that led toward the shrine of the famous English St. Thomas à Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who was murdered in his cathedral in 1170. Medieval pilgrims were notorious tale-tellers, liars, according to the austere Langland, and the sight and sound of the bands riding toward Canterbury may well have suggested to Chaucer the idea of using a fictitious pilgrimage as a framing device for a number of stories. Collections of stories linked by such a device were common in the later Middle Ages. Chaucer's contemporary John Gower had used one in his Confessio Amantis. Earlier in the century, Boccaccio had placed the 100 tales of his Decameron in the mouths of 10 characters, each of whom told a tale a day for 10 days. And another Italian, Giovanni Cercambi, had placed a series of stories in the mouth of the leader of a group of persons journeying on horseback. Even if, as seems likely, Chaucer was unaware of the Italian precedents, the device of the framing fiction was in the air. Chaucer's artistic exploitation of the device is, however, altogether his own. In Gower and Cercambi, one speaker relates all the stories, and in Boccaccio, the relationship between any one of the 10 speakers and the story he tells is haphazard, so that reassignment of all the stories to different speakers would not materially change the effect. But in the best of the Canterbury Tales, there is a fascinating accord between the narrator and his story, so that the story takes on rich overtones from what we have learned of its teller in the general prologue and elsewhere, and the character himself grows and is revealed by his story. Chaucer conducts 2 fictions simultaneously, that of the individual tale and that of the pilgrim to whom he has assigned it. He develops the second fiction not only through the general prologue, but also through the links, the interchanges among the pilgrims between stories. These interchanges sometimes lead to animosities. Thus the miller's tale offends the reeve, who, formerly a carpenter, sees himself slandered in the figure of the miller's silly, cuckolded carpenter, and the reeve replies with a story that scores a miller who seems very like the pilgrim miller. Similarly, the friar and the summoner quarrel at the end of the Wife of Bath's prologue, so that when the friar is called upon, he tells a tale most offensive to the summoner, who in turn retaliates with an even more offensive story about a friar. The effect of each of these tales is enhanced by the animus of its teller, while the description of the animus in the links is exciting in itself. We are given at once a story and a drama. Furthermore, the Wife of Bath's monstrous feminism sets up resonances that are felt through all the succeeding tales. Indeed, so powerful are these resonances that some see in them a thematic unifying device. The question of marriage that the wife introduces is further treated from 2 opposing points of view by the clerk and the merchant, and is finally settled by the common sense of the franklin. In addition to such artistic stratagems as these, the personality and mind of the reporter, a half-burlesque version of Chaucer himself, permeate the poem and enrich its meaning. The composition of none of the tales can be accurately dated. Most of them were written during the last 14 years of Chaucer's life, though some which fail to fit their tellers may be much earlier. The popularity of the poem in late medieval England is attested by the number of surviving manuscripts. More than 80. Mostly from the 15th century. It was also twice printed by Caxton, and often reprinted by Caxton's early successors. The manuscripts reflect the unfinished state of the poem, the fact that when he died Chaucer had not made up his mind about a number of details, and hence left many inconsistencies. The poem appears in the manuscripts as 9 or 10 fragments, or blocks of tales. The order of the poems within each fragment is generally the same, but the order of the fragments themselves varies widely. The fragment containing the general prologue, the Knights, Millers, and Reeves' tales, and the Cook's unfinished tale, always comes first, and the fragment consisting of the Parson's tale and the retraction always comes last. But the others, such as that containing the Wife of Bath, the Friar, and the Summoner, or that consisting of the Physician and Pardoner, or the longest fragment consisting of 6 tales concluding with the nuns' priests, are by no means stable in relation to one another. The order followed here is one of the two that seems most nearly satisfactory. The general prologue. Chaucer did not need to make a pilgrimage himself in order to meet the types of people that his fictitious pilgrimage includes, for most of them had long inhabited literature as well as life. The ideal knight, who had fought against the pagans in all the great battles of the last half-century. His son the squire, a lover out of any love poem. The prioress without a vocation, but with the dogs and jewelry that satirical literature was always condemning nuns for. The hunting monk and flattering friar, chief butts of medieval satirists. The too busy and too rich lawyer, the prosperous franklin, the fraudulent doctor, the wife or archwife of Bath, the austere parson, and so on down through the lower orders to that flamboyant hypocrite, the pardoner, a living vice. One meets all these types in medieval literature. And, since literature imitates life, one might have met them also in medieval society, as Chaucer, with his wide experience, undoubtedly did. Indeed, it has been argued that in some of his portraits, he is drawing real people. But the appearance of doing so is actually a function of his art, which is able to endow types with a reality we generally associate only with people we know. Chaucer achieves this effect largely by persuading us that his own interest lies only in the visible, in what actually met his eye on the pilgrimage. He pretends to let the salient features of each pilgrim leap out directly at the reader and does not seem to mind if some of his descriptions are from top to toe, others all toe and no top. This imitation of the way our minds actually perceive reality may make us fail to notice the care with which Chaucer has selected his details in order to give an integrated sketch of the person being described, while they are generally not full-blown literary symbols. Most of these details give something more than mere verisimilitude to the description. Actually, they mediate between the world of types and the world of real people. Independent bourgeois women of the time were often makers of cloth, so that the wife of Bath's proficiency at the trade is, in one way, merely part of her historical reality. Yet the first weaver of cloth was the unparadised Eve, and her descendant is an unregenerate member of the distaff side. The Franklin's red face and white beard are in the same way merely individualizing factors in the portrait. Yet, the red face and white beard seem always to associate themselves with a man of goodwill who likes good living. And since Chaucer's time they have become the distinguishing marks of a kind of mythic Franklin. Santa Claus. The rich suggestiveness of the details is what makes the portraits worth reading again and again. One may begin by enjoying the bright if flat photographic image of reality that the reporter creates. But one will find that the initial appearance of flatness is deceptive, and that the more one rereads, the more complex and significant the portraits become. Here, as elsewhere in his work, Chaucer shows himself to be a rival to Shakespeare in the art of providing entertainment on the most primitive level, and at the same time, of significantly increasing the reader's ability to comprehend reality.